Good morning. Today we welcome in session 6 three amazing papers in the Webs of Exclusion number 2. And we will first start with the paper of Franck Ollivon, who is from the École Normale Supérieure en France, and who will give a paper with Olivier Milhaud, who is for the Sorbonne University, and the paper is the Carceral archipelago is not that fast. Please, Frank, I give the floor to you.
You can hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So this paper comes from the thoughts Olivier and I shared during the first COVID-19 pandemic lockdown from March to May in France. At that time, the French media used to compare the COVID-19 lockdown to the carceral experience of inmates. There was this common use of the carceral metaphor to describe the lockdown because it relies on a dialectics between confined spaces and restricted movements. Connects to a larger debate within carceral studies and carceral geography in particular, where the use of the carceral metaphor is also widely spread following Foucault's urge to take into account the carceral archipelago. But how vast is this archipelago? To what extent can we qualify spaces or movements as being carceral? We ended up with a rather restrictive perspective where spaces and movements were not key aspects of the definition of the carceral, and we would be very happy to share it with you and get your critical comments. Our position rose from a conceptual dialogue we initiated with two texts, Michel Foucault's chapter on the carceral archipelago and Dominique Moran, Jennifer Turner, and Anna Schlier's paper conceptualizing the carceral in carceral geography. Their approach enabled us to refine the definition of the carceral and to underline some key aspects of the carceral which seem to us underestimated. Our definition of the carceral exceeds physical confinement to include unequal processes of alienation. By alienation, we mean temporary as well as long-term disaffiliation or breaking of social ties. But we would argue that the carceral isn't just any kind of alienation. It refers to an alienation produced through constraint, legal procedures, and moral stigmatization. First, our presentation tries to understand why the metaphor of the carceral archipelago can be misleading if we interpret it too broadly. Then, we deepen the dialogue with Dominique Moran, Jennifer Turner, and Anna Schlier by questioning what they call the qualifying conditions of the carceral. Finally, we propose to define the carceral as what exceeds physical confinement to include processes of alienation through constraint, legal procedures, and moral stigmatization. So Michel Foucault uses the phrase carceral archipelago in the very last chapter of Discipline and Punish. It refers first to a series of institutions, then to a network of punitive techniques, and lastly to the differentiation of illegalities which produces the delinquent as a criminal category. This Foucauldian metaphor proved to be highly stimulating for geographers. It has allowed us to connect many different settings and renew our vision of the social. This connection, we think, expand our horizons by focusing on the echoes between different sectors of public action. Indeed, many scholars have well established the penal net widening process. Moreover, some penal techniques have spread outside the penal field, and conversely, criminal systems incorporate techniques which were launched outside the penal field, like, for example, electronic monitoring. But despite its usefulness, the metaphor of the carceral archipelago might make us lose sight of what lies at the core of the carceral, what Foucault called the differential administration of illegalities, that is, the legal and moral constraints of some people. The circulation of carceral practices and experiences between settings does not necessarily make them carceral settings. It has an unquestionable heuristic value to study such a circulation because it shows the intricacies of social life Yet, the circulation of the carceral practices and experiences does not necessarily transform any gated community, any former prison, or any school into a carceral setting. What is relevant for the carcerality of migration control seems not relevant for anything else that does not have the same processes of differentiation by an administrative penal power, to quote Bosworth. In that sense, the post-prison landscape, such as the transformation of carceral spaces in non-legal sites, like, for example, Stockholm prison transformed into a hotel building. This transformation is extremely interesting to study from a geographical point of view, but this post-prison landscape may not be considered to help us define the domain of the carceral. Instead of a carceral continuum, we would prefer to speak of a carceral trajectory that ended with the transformation of the building. The word continuum has spatial and historical connotation, and it seems to us that the word trajectory points more clearly to a temporal dimension. So if we go back to Discipline and Punish, one can wonder if Foucault himself was really fond of his metaphor, which appears only 3 times in the chapter. With the carceral archipelago, Foucault actually seeks to show how discipline extends beyond prisons to schools, factories, hospitals, and so on. These different environments are designed to produce similar mechanisms of control, examination, classification, in other words, similar processes of normalization. Therefore, is carceral the right adjective? Maybe we should rather speak of a normalizing or a disciplinary archipelago instead of a carceral one. Foucault considers prisons as one particular form of disciplinary apparatus, a form that is, moreover, particularly situated in time. Certainly, it may appear to be the milestone from which all the others are thought, but it is nonetheless one among the others. It seems to us an important point to remember because it may change carceral geography quite a lot if we differentiate it from something that could be or would be the geography of disciplines, for example. Especially if we follow the idea put forward by French sociologist Gilles Chantraine of a post-disciplinary prison model that constitutes a significant shift in the punishment project described by Michel Foucault in Discipline and Punish. The archipelago as conceived by Foucault would thus be a disciplinary archipelago that should be distinguished from a strictly carceral archipelago that would refer to the specific forms of contemporary prison. Therefore, regarding the carceral archipelago, we share Dominique Morin, Jennifer Turner, and Anna Schlier's concern that by opening up the scope of the carceral endlessly, we might lose sight of what lies at the core of the carceral. But then how to limit the scope of this carceral archipelago? It seems to us that in the phrase carceral archipelago, a particular attention should be paid to the word archipelago. If we go back to the etymology of the word, it refers to the chief sea. Originally, it's a mistranslation of the Greek name for the Aegean Sea. Then, in the carceral archipelago, we should look less at the large group of islands and more at the large body of water between these islands. In other words, what makes the carceral archipelago is the link, the body of water, between the different elements, the islands, rather than the nature of those elements, whether they are carceral or not. But then, what is this body of water made of? On this question, we believe that Dominique Morin, Jennifer Turner, and Anna Schlier's paper provides some particularly stimulating avenues for reflection. In their timely paper, the authors identified what they call qualifying conditions of the carceral, namely detriment, intention, and spatiality. Intention, in particular, seems to us of profitable value because it reminds us that the carceral takes part in a political scheme. It underlines the fact that there is always some sort of rationale behind the carceral, however ambiguous and conflicting. In other words, the carceral is thought of as one specific political answer to a social phenomenon. Then regarding intention, we should bear in mind 3 fundamental aspects. This rationale is not determined once and for all. In its content, it may change over time, sometimes in very radical ways. But despite the variations in the political agenda, there is still an underlying discourse that legitimizes the carceral and its temporary functions. Secondly, this political rationale may never come to fruition, or never as intended, and therefore never be experienced as such. But this rationale is always significant. It reveals how the castle is conceived in a particular society and at a particular time. This rationale is very often a state prerogative, but it also involves other stakeholders, from the subcontracting private companies to those who work within the castle, agents, educators, penitentiary counselors, and so on. But in the paper, intention is highly reliant on the first condition, detriment, as the authors specify that they develop intention vis-à-vis detriment. In other words, the paper seems to put the detrimental experience of those suffering it in the foreground and to relegate the question of intentionality to the background. In our opinion, it raises two issues. First, the castle is not necessarily described as detrimental by those who experience it. When you talk to probationers under electronic monitoring, for example, you realize that the experience of this kind of punishment is really ambivalent. Lots of them describe something which is really harsh, depressing, to the extent that they sometimes regret not being incarcerated. But others describe an experience which is completely different. They depict electronic monitoring as something which helped them to settle down, to learn how to become a father or a husband, for example. The second issue is linked to the first one. Detriment can be assessed only at the individual level, whether we define it as a physical or a psychological harm. So detriment is an individual experience and to a certain extent a subjective experience. Therefore, how do we as scientists identify it? How do we trace it? And in other words, what is detrimental enough to be carceral? This doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay attention to how the carceral is experienced. It seems to us very important to document the effects of different carceral settings on the individuals who are incarcerated. Let us be clear on that point. But we are not convinced that it should serve as a criterion to define the carceral. Focusing on individual experience runs the risk of widening the scope of the carceral. Something can be detrimental without being carceral, while missing out some aspects of the carceral. The carceral is not necessarily experienced as detrimental. So it seems to us that the carceral can be better grasped through its intentionality rather than through its experience. As for the last criterion, spatiality, it seems necessary to clarify its meaning. On the one hand, a large body of literature has shown that this spatiality cannot be restricted to confinement or fixity, but incorporates forms of movements at different scales. On the other hand, it would be reductive to consider that the spatiality of the carceral is only produced through the use of a material apparatus of any kind, like walls, barbed wire, doors, fence, etc. Because it would set aside some contemporary avatars of the carceral, like, for example, probation. So we believe that we must continue to dig around the spatiality of the carceral. Therefore, we would like to suggest that the spatiality of the carceral relies on a particular form of alienation which is mediated through legal procedures, constraints, and moral stigmatization. So first, the carceral relies on different forms of constraints applied to any kind of individual. By constraint, we mean that the individual has some obligations to meet, some assignments or tasks to perform. Such a statement deserves further comments. First, these obligations are not necessarily linked to any spatial confinement. On the contrary, the constraint can be achieved through forced or coerced mobility, as it is well established by many scholars. Secondly, the individuals who are constrained don't necessarily experience it as a constraint because the obligation they have to fulfill may fit their own desires, their own agenda. In other words, the constraint is not achieved through detriment, the suffering it may or may not produce, but through the restriction in the individual's ability to choose, and in particular to choose if they move, where they move, and when to move. But as it relies on a restriction of a fundamental right, the carceral constraint is necessarily framed by legal procedures. By legal procedures, we mean at the same time legal text and legal interpretations by any judicial authority. These legal procedures are not necessarily criminal, but can be also administrative or therapeutic. And finally, it does not mean that every carceral situation is actually legal. Some individuals may be detained illegally or at least without any legal status, as for example in Guantanamo Bay. But even when it is illegal, carceral constraint is open to judicial litigation at different scales. So what we're saying here is that at the very least, the carceral maintains a dialectical relationship with the law. Finally, the carceral constraint is supposed to create a divide between the individual who is targeted by the institution and the rest of the population. This is the reason why we propose a third characteristic of the carceral, which is the moral stigmatization. Because the individual is constrained, he is deprived from a complete social inclusion, hence our use of the term alienation. And therefore he is stigmatized as deviant or abnormal. A series of tactics can be used separately or even combined in order to achieve this goal. First, particular places like prisons or detention centers or halfway houses. It's also material artifacts like electronic tag or jackets for community service.
5 minutes.
And finally, it can be institutional discourse that reminds the individual of his or her particular status. In conclusion, the call for paper of this conference questioned the combination of spaces and movements as key elements of the definition of the carceral. We would say that movements are so manifold in carceral and in carceral settings and outside that they cannot be key elements of the definition. Speciality is more to be found in the differentiated treatment of those who are taken into a carceral situation and the others. So we have tried to propose a limited definition of the carceral because we think that it allowed to better conceptualize the comparisons of settings and experiences, spaces and movements in reference to the carceral. Let's consider, for instance, prison and electronic monitoring, which are both carceral in our view. Trying to understand one or the other means, in fact, trying to understand how they differ from non-carceral situations and from other carceral situations that may change a lot over time and space. There begin tricky questions. First, on the extent of the comparison. Should we stick to close historical and geographical contexts or envision huge comparisons between different settings at different times in extremely different places? Like, for example, electronic monitoring in contemporary France and prison in ancient Rome. Secondly, there is a question on scales. What are the relevant scales to make the comparison? Is the apartment of the probationers comparable to a prison cell or to a prison building? Thirdly, there is a question on the analytical framework. What are the multiple analytical frameworks we should use to avoid having only one framework, which should make us focus only on the lowest common denominator? Finally, there is a question on fields. Should the data collection follow the same methodology in the different settings? Is interviewing inmates in prison similar to interviewing probationers at their home? To put it short, through the COVID-19 lockdown, we were not all taken into a carceral world. The fact that the carceral archipelago is not that vast does not mean that the task of carceral geographers is too narrow and almost finished. It only begins, and the collective discussion on the definition of the carceral is definitely not closed. Thank you.
So thank you, Frank, for your interesting paper together with Olivier, who is also present here in case of any questions. We received some questions in the Q&A. So the first one, I think it's from Anna Schliege, but I'm not sure. It's called moderator in here. She or he wants to thank you for your interesting presentation. And it appears to be from Christophe, who says, I was wondering how you feel about notions of carceral city by Davies, who sees the spread of the carceral into your urban space. So where do you think we should draw the line with characterizing the carceral?
So I think that what Olivier and I would answer to that is that so you have a circulation of different techniques that can be found in the different in cities and in carceral spaces. But what we would say that it's a wide use of the metaphor. In carceral cities, the carceral is only metaphorical, and it's not proper carceral spaces.
Okay, thank you. I have the about the moral stigma you were talking about. The moral stigma of incarceration can be positive in a certain social context. Do you have any thoughts about this ambiguity of the moral stigma?
Yes, it's a good question. The stigma is, if we go back to Goffman, this is what he says, and the stigma can be also a sign which is a common characteristic for a social group. So it's not necessarily something which is seen as bad for the population, which is who is stigmatized. But so yes, it's ambiguous. It's not the meaning of the stigma. The stigma is not closed. It's always open to interpretation by the different person who are stigmatized and those who are not stigmatized. I'm sure it's clear my answer, but maybe Olivier wants to add something.
Yeah, maybe it's the well. Thanks again for the questions. But maybe what is interesting with the stigma is the differentiation of populations. And I think it's what we wanted to say, that the differentiation of the population is key. And so that's why when we use the metaphor very broadly, just as the example given about carceral cities, there is this risk of losing population differentiation. And if we lose this differentiation, if we miss it, we are afraid the comparisons will not be as fruitful as they could be. So I know our presentation is somewhat strange to close, so to speak, the meaning of the metaphor. But once again, it is not to close it just for closing it. It's to close it to open new comparisons. And so that's why it's what is interesting with the stigma is the differentiation. And it's not only the stigma, but also what Franck explained about the constraint and the dialectical relationship with the law.
Thank you, Olivier and Frank. We received several questions, so I go on with them. There is a question of Corentin Durand, who asks, I would love to hear your thoughts on the French prison ombudsman's decision not to control any places of the lockdown, despite his authority expanding to any places where persons are deprived of liberty by an administrative or legal decision, like asylums, immigrant detention, and so on.
It's a really good question. I'm not sure I have a real answer clear answer to that. I think it's more it's a debate. It's open to a debate, and clearly we could argue that. I think yeah, I don't know. Maybe Olivier can answer, because I think it's a debate. It's an open debate whether we open the control of the control of our homes during the lockdown. Does it need to be taken into the control of any authority? I don't know. Frankly, I don't know.
Yeah, and plus, I don't know if it was just, you know, a question of not having enough, enough people to work on that. To be honest, to answer to Quentin, I was really surprised that the French prison ombudsman decided that. There was the same debate with places for old people, and the French prison ombudsman said, "Oh, you know, we are." The government also said it is out of your scope, even if some people belonging to the French ombudsman organization said, well, it is kind of deprivation of liberty, so we should take care of these places.
Okay, thank you. And then we've received a question from Amber Nicholas, who was wondering how we might approach intentionality for the range of interventions and reforms that do not announce or rather hide their carceral intent, things like parole or which set out to help. You're still muted, Frank. Sorry.
I read the wrong question, so can you repeat the question, please?
I wonder how we might approach intentionality for the range of interventions and reforms that do not announce or rather hide their carceral intent, like parole or which set out to help. And it's also the case for youth detention.
The thing is, I don't know if they don't. Are they not announcing their carceral intents, or I don't see how. It's difficult to answer this question because I don't know necessarily well the context, but my point, I worked on the French probation, and which is really interesting is that there is always a kind of link which is undertaken between the probation and the carceral system. So I don't know. It depends a lot on the context where the analysis takes place, but something can be not announced as carceral and still be carceral in the intention. Or it can be compared to something which is carceral. I mean, even in prison, in the probation, we don't say, oh, it's gonna be carceral. We say there is a form of probation and there is a link with the prison through the law, through legal procedures, but it's not announced as really carceral per se. It's carceral because there is this legal environment, there is this discourse within the institution that creates the link with the carceral.
Okay, and Frank, there was a little bit a bug in here. Maybe Olivier, can you rephrase some of the things that Frank mentioned?
Yeah, it was just to underline that what is extremely interesting about intention, and so that's why we really appreciated the paper by Dominique Moran, Jennifer Turner, and Anna Schlier, that they point to this idea that there is a rationale behind. And of course, maybe you remember Franck said it is an ambiguous and a conflicting rationale. And so the question raised about youth detention or about parole or other systems that pretend not to be overtly carceral is highly interesting because it points to this ambiguous rationale. But at least there is the idea that there will be a political intention to solve a social problem, and so I think that's the point, that some people are treated as a problem, and what we would call carceral, the carceral organization is there to solve this problem. So it is like reducing the life of people and subjectivities to being only a problem to be solved.
Sorry, now it's working. Hi, sorry, I think we lost Anouk, the chair of the session, so I'm just chipping in here. There's maybe time for one more question before we move on to the next speaker. There were many more questions than we can answer here. I'm just reading out one more, which is asking by Deirdre Conlon. I wonder if you could say more about the archipelago understood as a linking of elements. Is this also conceived as a linking of spaces, or is it articulated as a linking of concepts and processes?
Do you want to answer, Olivier, or do I?
No.
What we're saying with the archipelago is that there is a it's rather the second analysis. I mean, we acknowledge the fact that there is you can have a kind of carceral archipelago which is made of different sites, which are carceral sites. But what we're saying that there is something that links these sites, and that there is something we should work on, which is the link, the conceptual link between the different sites, which take part to the archipelago.
Yeah, it goes beyond the linking of spaces and articulate the linking of concepts, as Deirdre mentioned in the chat. Yeah, it's this idea of focusing on the large body of water, so the linking of concepts and processes that enable fruitful comparisons. Because if we just compare spaces, you know, there is a risk of having less fruitful comparisons.
Sorry, hi, it's me again. There's still some technical issues, so it would be great if we could move to Carolina next, as opposed to Christoph, who will join us at the end of the session. We're just going to get it ready, so I'm just going to read out one more question to you guys. I know that you had lots of questions. I hope you can cope with one more just now. So Constanza Kuru is asking, how do we think of carcerality vis-a-vis class, race and gender inequalities and violence?
Yeah, for us, well, thank you. Thanks again for this very interesting question. For us, it is more like descriptive, the descriptive values. It is just like subjectivities and experiences. Of course, we must study subjectivities and experiences, just as we really need to consider class issues and race issues and gender issues, but we will not use them as defining criteria. Well, I think, I don't know if Franck wants to add something about that. So yes. Carcerality would be an expression of such inequality, but as a descriptive value.
Yes, and just to add one thing is that class, race, gender can used, can be announced in the different intentions that we talked about. But yeah, they are not necessarily a criterion to define the carceral. We think we can study the effects on the different populations which are taken in charge by the carceral institutions, but it's not really criterion, conceptual criterion, which is operational for us.
Sorry, the technical issues seem to continue. I'm just going to introduce the next speaker, who's Carolina Sanchez, and she's currently working for 3 different universities. I hope I get them right. The Université de Paris, University of New York, and the IMC of Aarhus University in Denmark. She's just going to get her slides ready. No, she's not. I can see. Okay. It seems like there's some issues with loading up the right presentation and sharing it. I'm gonna just read out her talk anyway while she's trying to fix it. It's called Digital Confinement: Reconfigurations of Mobility and Space through Electronic Monitoring and Facial Recognition for Migration Control in the United States of America. We're just going to give her a moment to get it ready. While we do that, I'm wondering if it might be possible to just continue the conversation we've had before. I don't know if Franck and Olivier are still there. Yes, they are. That's brilliant. So there were some more questions from Constanza asking about, so we've discussed how class, race and gender inequalities kind of come into play. And she's asking further, can we think of any space in which such inequalities and violence are present as non-carceral? Olivier, do you want to say?
Thank you very much once again for this question. Maybe we didn't answer in a correct way just before, being not clear enough. Inequalities and violence, especially linked to class, race, and gender, are present in many settings. Well, I would say almost everywhere. So for us, what is interesting with carceralities is that carcerality is how to say that in English? It's a place where, carcerality refers to places where such phenomena are increased or more important than usually. So of course you could find many spaces and contexts and situations where you would have inequalities and violence related to class, race and gender, for instance, in cities or elsewhere, without speaking of carceral settings. That would be my question to the place we give to violence. We were quite aware with Franck that there was a risk that our presentation would be thought as a way to decrease the violence of incarceration. It was more that this violence is highly and harshly experienced by people, but some of them do not experience it. And so that's why we didn't want to take it as a defining or qualifying condition.
Okay, just one very final question for you. You've got real grilling here. Isn't the problem of intentionality linked to the question of whose intention it is? So can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so here we are referring to a work, the works of especially Didier Fassin, who and lots of French sociologists and anthropologists who said that there is the moral of the state, which is made of made of different things, and in particular the different ways the state discourse, the texts are are reproduced by the different agents who embodies the state, or who embodies the state. So the idea here is that this intentionality, it's made of different political statements, different legal texts, but it's also reproduced through the discourse of the different agents who make the states something more real, more concrete for the different people, for everybody.
Thank you so very much for answering all